The heat in the valley did not simply exist. It pressed down upon the earth with a physical weight, flattening the sagebrush and turning the dust of the road into a choking, fine powder that coated the back of the throat. It was the kind of heat that silenced the birds and drove the coyotes into the deepest shadows of the canyon, leaving only the rhythmic, dry rasp of the cicadas to mark the passage of time. Samuel stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the station, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the relentless glare, though it did little to hide the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains behind him, weathered by loss and stiffened by a solitude that had spanned 3 long years. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their sympathy having long ago curdled into a pitying sort of judgment, whispering that the ranch was dying just as surely as the spirit of the man who tended it. They watched him now, leaning against the hitching post, his knuckles white as he gripped the reins of his wagon, waiting for the stagecoach that was already an hour late. When the heavy wheels finally ground to a halt in front of the depot, kicking up a cloud of ochre dust, the silence in the town square deepened, heavy with expectation. The door of the coach swung open, and for a moment nothing moved but the settling dust. Then a boot touched the step, followed by the sweep of a skirt that seemed to defy the drab, sun-bleached palette of the territory. Mei Lin stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, and the color of her dress was a shock to the senses, a vibrant, deep crimson that looked like a fresh wound against the pale dirt. She was younger than the whispers had suggested, perhaps 25, with raven hair pulled back severely from a face that possessed a delicate, terrifying beauty. She stood tall despite the long journey, her eyes scanning the row of grim faces until they landed on Samuel. She did not smile. There was no curtsy, no nervous flutter of hands. She simply held his gaze with a terrifying calmness, clutching a single, battered leather valise against her stomach. The town matriarch, Mrs. Halloway, audibly gasped from the shade of the general store, scandalized not just by the woman's ethnicity, a rare sight in this forgotten corner of the territory, but by the sheer, unapologetic brightness of that red prairie dress. Samuel felt the weight of the town's stare, a mixture of mockery and disbelief that he, a man who could barely keep his own house standing, had brought a bride into this desolation. He stepped forward, saying nothing, and took the bag from her hand. It was lighter than he expected, as if she had brought nothing of her past life with her. He gestured toward the wagon, the wood bleached gray by the sun. "Get in," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It was the only thing he said to her for the first 10 miles. The journey to the ranch was a slow crawl through a landscape that seemed determined to reject human life. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rutted track, the wheels protesting every revolution. Mei Lin sat upright on the hard bench, her posture rigid, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at him, nor did she look at the towering mesas that rose like red cathedrals in the distance. She watched the horizon, her expression unreadable, though Samuel noticed the way her fingers occasionally tightened on the fabric of her dress, the only betrayal of her nerves. The air between them was thick, charged with the awkwardness of 2 strangers bound by a contract neither had truly written. Samuel had sent for a wife because the loneliness had become a physical pain, a hollow ache in his chest that woke him in the night. But now that she was here, the reality of her presence felt like an intrusion. He was a man of silence, of routines born of grief, and her vibrant presence felt loud even when she made no sound. They passed the dried creek bed, the stones white as bones, and the skeleton of the old windmill that had shorn a blade in the last winter storm. When the ranch house finally came into view, it looked small and defeated against the vastness of the prairie, the porch sagging, the paint long since stripped away by the wind. Samuel pulled the horses to a stop and looked at her, expecting to see disappointment or fear. Instead, Maylin looked at the house with a clinical, assessing gaze. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, and climbed down without waiting for his help. The interior of the house was a testament to a man who had stopped caring about anything other than survival. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the gloom, illuminating the layers of neglect that covered every surface. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee, wood smoke, and the sour scent of unwashed linens. Dirty plates were stacked precariously in the basin, and the floor was swept only in the paths where Samuel walked most frequently. He stood in the doorway, suddenly ashamed in a way he hadn't been for years. He watched her as she placed her valise on the only clean chair in the room. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes taking in the unmade bed in the corner, the cold stove, the blackened kettle. Samuel cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "The spare room is back there," he said, pointing to a door that had been shut since his wife passed. "It has a bed. It's quiet." Maylin looked at the door, then back at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low, melodic but firm, with an accent that softened the hard edges of the language. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of a woman's voice in this house, where only silence had reigned, felt ghost-like. She did not ask for water. She did not complain about the heat. She simply walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the darkness of the room, closing it softly behind her. Samuel stood alone in the kitchen, the red after-image of her dress still burning in his mind, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The morning sun broke over the valley with a violence that promised another day of scorching heat, but Samuel was not woken by the light. He was woken by the sound of sweeping. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound, persistent and energetic. He sat up, groggy and disoriented, the memory of the previous day rushing back to him. He pulled on his trousers and boots, his heart hammering a strange rhythm against his ribs. When he walked into the main room, he stopped dead. The kitchen was transformed. It was not that it was suddenly luxurious. The furniture was still broken, the walls still bare, but the filth was gone. The floor had been scrubbed with such vigor that the wood grain stood out pale and clean. The stack of dishes was gone, washed and dried and stacked neatly on the shelf. The stove was black and shining, a fire already crackling within it, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, rich and inviting. Maylin was outside, visible through the open door, bent over the water trough. She had tied the skirts of her red dress up around her waist to keep them dry, revealing plain leather boots and the white cotton of her petticoats. She was scrubbing the linens he had neglected for months, her arms moving with a tireless mechanical efficiency. Samuel watched her for a long time, the coffee untouched on the table. He had expected her to be delicate, a city woman who would wither under the harsh reality of the frontier. He had expected tears. He had not expected this ferocious industry. He walked to the doorway and leaned against the frame. She sensed him and paused, wiping a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wet hand. She didn't smile. She pointed to the garden patch, a desolate square of weeds and cracked earth. "That," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "it needs water. Today." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Samuel nodded slowly, unable to find the words to argue. By the third day, the silence between them had shifted from awkward to companionable, grounded in the shared language of labor. The heat had intensified, the mercury climbing until the air shimmered and danced above the ground. Samuel spent his days on the range, checking the herd, moving them from one drying water hole to another, his anxiety about the drought gnawing at his gut. Every evening he returned to the ranch expecting to find Maylin exhausted, defeated, perhaps packed and waiting to leave. Instead, he found the ranch slowly coming back to life. She attacked the work with a terrifying intensity. She had cleared the garden of weeds, hacking at the stubborn roots with a hoe until her hands must have been blistered and raw, though she never showed him her palms. She carried buckets of water from the pump, back and forth, back and forth, until the dry earth turned dark and receptive. She found a stash of old seeds in the cellar, beans, squash, corn, and planted them in neat military rows. Samuel watched her from the barn, pretending to oil a harness. He saw the way she paused to wipe sweat from her neck, the way she drank from the ladle with thirsty gulps. But she never stopped for long. She was like the ironwood trees that grew in the canyons, hard, unyielding, surviving on almost nothing. That evening, as they ate a stew she had made from dried venison and wild onions she had foraged, he looked at her across the table. The lamplight cast deep shadows on her face. "The well is low," he said, the first voluntary conversation he had initiated. "If the rain doesn't come," he trailed off. Maylin looked up, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Then we dig deeper," she said simply. "Or we find the spring." "There is no spring," Samuel replied, his voice heavy with the pessimism that had become his armor. "Not on this land. My father looked. I looked." Maylin lowered her spoon. "You looked with your eyes," she said, tapping her temple. "You did not look with the land." She stood up and cleared the plates, ending the conversation. It was infuriating, her certainty. It was arrogant. And yet, the next morning, he saw her walking the perimeter of the homestead, not looking at the ground, but watching the way the birds flew, the way the few surviving insects gathered. She was reading the ranch in a language he had forgotten or never learned. Later that day, a rider approached from the east. It was Thomas, a neighbor whose land bordered Samuel's. Thomas was a man who thrived on the misfortunes of others, his eyes always counting Samuel's cattle, waiting for the inevitable foreclosure. He rode up to the fence line where Samuel was repairing a post, his gaze immediately drifting to Maylin, who was beating a rug over the porch railing. Thomas let out a low, mocking whistle. "So it's true," he sneered, leaning over his saddle horn. "Bought yourself a china doll, did you, Sam? Heard folks talking in town. Said she looked like a parade float in that dress." Samuel's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the hammer until his knuckles cracked. "She's my wife, Thomas. You'll speak with respect." Thomas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Wife? She's a curiosity, Sam. She won't last a week out here. Look at her. Too small. Too pretty. The sun'll cook her alive." Before Samuel could respond, a commotion erupted near the barn. The old stallion, a temperamental beast that Samuel had been meaning to break for months, had snapped its tether. It reared up, hooves flashing in the sunlight, screaming in panic. Thomas's horse spooked, dancing sideways. "Hell, Sam, put a bullet in it before it kills someone," Thomas shouted. Samuel dropped his hammer and ran toward the gate, but Maylin was closer. She didn't run away. She didn't scream. She dropped the rug and walked toward the thrashing animal. She moved differently than Samuel did. She didn't square her shoulders or shout. She made herself small, her movements fluid and slow. She began to hum, a low, droning sound that cut through the panic of the yard. The stallion, eyes rolling white with fear, struck out, a hoof missing her shoulder by inches. Thomas yelled, "Get her out of there, you fool!" But Samuel stopped. He saw something in the way the horse's ears flickered. Maylin stood her ground, the red dress billowing in the dust, her hand extended, palm up. She spoke to the horse in her own language, soft, rhythmic words that sounded like water flowing over stones. The stallion snorted, tossing its head, but it didn't strike again. Slowly, impossibly, it lowered its head. Maylin stepped forward and laid her hand on its nose. The beast shuddered and stood still, its sides heaving. She stroked its neck once, then turned and looked at Thomas. Her expression was bored. She picked up the lead rope and tied it securely, then went back to the porch and picked up her rug. Thomas sat on his horse, his mouth slightly open, the mockery dead in his throat. He looked at Samuel, then tipped his hat without a word and rode away. The end of the week brought the true test, the moment that would sear itself into the memory of the valley. The heat broke, but not with rain. It broke with a dry lightning storm that set the nerves on edge, the sky cracking open with purple fissures but delivering no water. The air was electric, heavy and suffocating. Samuel was in the north pasture when he heard the distress call of a cow. It was one of his best breeders, a Hereford he had banked his next year's earnings on. She was down in the gully, laboring. By the time Samuel reached her, he knew it was bad. The calf was breeched, twisted in the womb. The cow was exhausted, her eyes dull, her breathing shallow gasps. Samuel worked for an hour, his arms slick with blood and mucus, trying to turn the calf, but he couldn't get a purchase. The cow groaned, a sound of utter defeat. Samuel sat back in the dirt, wiping his face with his sleeve, despair crashing over him. He had lost the crop, he was losing the herd, and now this. He stood up, his legs shaking, and reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. It was the mercy kill. There was nothing else to do. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel and turned. Maylin was there. She had walked 2 miles in the heat, carrying a water skin and a bundle of clean rags. She saw the rifle in his hand, then looked at the cow. She didn't ask permission. She dropped the water skin and walked into the gully. "No," Samuel rasped. "It's too late. She's too tight. The calf is dead." Maylin ignored him. She knelt in the bloody mud, heedless of the red dress that was now stained dark. She rolled her sleeves up past her elbows, her arms thin and pale against the gore. She placed her hands on the cow's distended belly, closing her eyes, feeling the position of the life inside. Then she moved. She didn't use brute strength. She used leverage. She pushed the calf back in, fighting the cow's contractions, murmuring that same rhythmic chant she had used on the horse. Samuel watched, frozen, as she worked with a surgeon's precision. For 20 minutes she struggled, sweat dripping from her nose, her teeth gritted. Then, with a sudden, wet slide, she rotated her hands, hooked the legs, and pulled. The calf slid out in a rush of fluids, limp and blue. Samuel sighed, the loss confirmed. But Maylin was not done. She grabbed the calf by its hind legs and hoisted it into the air, slapping its ribs, clearing its mouth with her own fingers. She shook it, once, twice. The calf convulsed, coughed, and let out a thin, wet bleat. The cow lifted her head, answering. Maylin lowered the calf to the ground, where it shook its head and tried to rise. She sat back on her heels, covered in blood and filth, her chest heaving. She looked up at Samuel, who was still holding the rifle, his mouth agape. She pointed to the canteen. "Water," she said, "for the mother." News traveled fast in the valley, faster than the wind. By Sunday, the story of the Chinese bride who had walked into a stallion's hooves and pulled a calf from the dead had reached the church, the saloon, and the general store. They said she had magic. They said she was a witch. But the older ranchers, the men who knew the difference between magic and grit, listened with narrowed eyes. They knew that saving a breech birth with small hands wasn't magic. It was skill. And walking down a stallion wasn't a spell. It was courage. On Sunday morning, Samuel hitched the wagon. He didn't ask her if she wanted to go to town. He simply waited. Maylin emerged from the house. She had washed the red dress, though the faint stains of the labor remained on the hem, a badge of honor she did not try to hide. She climbed up beside him. As they rode into Oak Haven, the streets were busy. People stopped walking. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. As the wagon passed the general store, Thomas was standing there. He didn't sneer. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. Mrs. Halloway stopped her sweeping and watched. They weren't looking at a mail-order bride anymore. They were looking at a rancher. Samuel sat straighter, the reins light in his hands. He looked at May Lynn. She was looking straight ahead, her chin high, her face composed. But for the first time, Samuel saw her hand move across the seat, just an inch, until her pinky finger brushed against the fabric of his coat. He didn't pull away. The weeks that followed the incident with the calf were not marked by triumph, but by a slow, grinding attrition as the drought tightened its grip on the valley like a noose. The sky remained a relentless, cloudless expanse of pale blue, bleaching the color from the land until the world seemed composed entirely of sepia tones and gray dust. The creek, which had been a trickling lifeline when May Lynn arrived, was now nothing more than a cracked mosaic of dried mud, the stones baking in the sun like old bones. Samuel spent his days riding the fence lines, not to repair them, but to chase the gaunt cattle away from the dried-up wallows where they stood lowing in confusion, their ribs pressing against their hides like the staves of broken barrels. Every evening he returned to the ranch house with the dust of failure coating his skin, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a mathematics that no longer added up. There was simply not enough water. The main well, the deep shaft his father had dug 40 years ago, was coughing up nothing but brown sludge, smelling of sulfur and ancient decay. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, the ledger open before him, the numbers blurring in the dim light of the oil lamp. He had begun to calculate the price of selling the herd for slaughter, a fraction of their worth, just to salvage enough money to buy passage somewhere else, somewhere green. He didn't know where that would be. He only knew that this land, which he had loved with a fierce, possessive pride, was finally rejecting him. May Lynn was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans that had been soaking for 2 days to soften. She moved with that same economy of motion, but he noticed the shadows under her eyes were darker, her cheekbones sharper. She placed a bowl before him, the steam rising in the hot room. "The windmill is silent," she said, her voice cutting through the scratching of his pen. It wasn't a question. "There's no wind," Samuel replied, not looking up. "And even if there was, the pipe is sucking air. The aquifer is gone, May Lynn. It's finished." He closed the ledger with a heavy thud, the sound of a coffin lid falling. May Lynn did not sit down. She walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit yard, where the shadows of the desiccated cornstalks stretched like skeletal fingers across the dirt. "The aquifer is not gone," she said quietly. "It has moved. The earth shifts. You dig where the water was, not where it is." Samuel rubbed his face with his calloused hands, the friction sounding like sandpaper. He was too tired to argue, too tired to explain the geology of the basin to a woman who looked at the land as if it were a living body rather than a resource to be mined. "And where is it then?" he asked, his voice laced with a bitter fatigue. "Did the birds tell you? Did the wind whisper it?" He regretted the sarcasm the moment it left his lips, but he didn't apologize. May Lynn turned from the window. She went to the corner of the room where she kept her few belongings and retrieved a long, forked branch of willow she had cut from the riverbed miles away in the first week. She placed it on the table on top of his ledger. "Tomorrow," she said, her eyes dark and unyielding, "we go to the North Ridge, near the Split Rock." Samuel stared at the stick, then at her. The North Ridge was granite and shale, the hardest ground on the ranch. "That's stone," he said flatly. "Solid stone. You can't dig a well in granite." May Lynn picked up the bowls. "Stone breaks," she said. "Water is stronger than stone. It just takes time." She left him there with the ledger and the willow branch, the silence of the house settling around him again. But this time it was not the silence of resignation. It was the silence of a challenge. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, they stood on the North Ridge. The air was already warm, carrying the scent of sage and heated rock. The location Maylin had chosen was a desolate shelf of land that overlooked the canyon, a place where nothing grew but hardy scrub oak and stubborn thistles. It seemed the most unlikely place for water in the entire territory. Samuel held the pickaxe, its weight familiar and heavy in his hands, feeling foolish. He looked at Maylin, who was walking slowly back and forth across the rocky ground, the willow branch held loosely in her hands. She was not wearing the red dress today. She wore a pair of trousers she had cut down from his old ones, belted tightly at the waist, and a loose cotton shirt. She looked small against the vastness of the sky, fragile. He watched as the branch suddenly dipped, the tip pointing violently toward the earth. She stopped, marked the spot with the heel of her boot, and looked at him. "Here," she said. Samuel spat on the ground. "This is bedrock, Maylin. We'll break our backs before we go 3 feet." She didn't move. She picked up the shovel and drove it into the soil with a grunt of effort. The metal clanged against rock almost immediately. She didn't stop. She lifted the shovel, repositioned it, and struck again. Samuel watched her for a full minute, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to acknowledge the impossibility of the task. A strange feeling swelled in his chest, part anger, part admiration, part desperate hope. He walked over, pushed her gently aside, and raised the pickaxe. He brought it down with a savage grunt, sparks flying as the steel bit into the shale. "If we do this," he said, his voice rhythmic with the swinging of the axe, "we don't stop. Not until we hit water or we hit hell." Maylin picked up the shovel and began to clear the rubble he loosened. "We will not hit hell," she said, tossing a load of rocks aside. "Hell is drying up. We are digging for heaven." By the 4th day, the hole was deep enough that Samuel disappeared into it up to his waist. The labor was a brutal physical punishment that transcended simple work and became a war against the earth itself. The sun beat down on their backs with a malice that felt personal, burning through their shirts and searing the skin of their necks. Samuel's hands were raw, the calluses torn open and bleeding, wrapped in strips of cloth that Maylin changed every night with a silent, tender efficiency. They spoke very little during the day. The only sounds were the rhythmic clink-thud of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, and the harsh rasp of their breathing. They worked in a trance state, fueled by a desperation that had stripped away all pretenses. Samuel found himself watching her as she hauled the heavy buckets of debris up from the hole. She never complained. She never asked to stop. When her strength failed, she simply used leverage, finding ways to move rocks that should have been too heavy for her. She was relentless, a force of nature that matched the harshness of the land. At noon, they sat in the sliver of shade cast by the wagon, sharing a canteen of warm, metallic-tasting water and hard biscuits. It was during these brief respites that the distance between them began to evaporate completely. "My father," Maylin said on the 5th day, staring out at the shimmering heat haze. "He was a builder of canals in the south. He taught me that water wants to be found. It cries out if you know how to listen." Samuel looked at her, seeing for the first time the life she had left behind, the history that lived in her bones. "My father was a breaker of horses," Samuel replied, his voice rough. "He taught me that you can't force a living thing to do what it doesn't want to. I always thought the land was like a horse, wild, needs to be broken." Maylin turned to him, her eyes intense. "The land is not a horse, Samuel. It is a mother. You do not break a mother. You ask her for help." The distinction hung in the air, shifting something fundamental in Samuel's understanding. He had spent his life fighting this valley, wrestling a living from it. She was suggesting a partnership. He finished his water and stood up, his joints popping. "Let's go ask her again," he said, offering her a hand. She took it, her grip strong and rough, and for a moment they stood there, hand in hand against the desolation, 2 soldiers in a foxhole of their own making. The crisis came on the 7th day. They were down 12 feet, cutting through a layer of hard-pan clay that was as dense as concrete. The heat was at its peak, the temperature soaring to a degree that made the air feel like the inside of an oven. Samuel was in the hole, swinging the pick with a mechanical, mindless rhythm. He was exhausted beyond the point of feeling. He was moving on instinct alone. He swung the pick, and as it struck the clay, the handle snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. The vibration jarred his arms all the way to his shoulders, and he stumbled, falling against the dirt wall. The frustration that had been building for weeks, the fear, the grief, it all exploded. He grabbed the broken head of the pick and hurled it out of the hole, yelling a curse that tore at his throat. "It's useless!" he screamed, looking up at the circle of blue sky. "There's nothing here! We're digging a grave, Maylin! Just a damn grave!" He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat in the dirt, his head in his hands, weeping dry, shuddering sobs. It was the first time he had broken. The silence from above was absolute. He waited for her to leave, to finally accept that he was a failure, that this land had beaten him. Instead, a shadow fell over him. A rope lowered, and attached to it was the heavy sledgehammer and the short steel chisel. Then Maylin's face appeared at the rim of the well, silhouetted against the blinding sun. She didn't look pitying, she looked fierce. "Get up," she commanded, her voice echoing in the confined space. "The handle broke because the wood was weak. The steel is not weak. You are not weak." Samuel wiped his face, smearing dirt and sweat. "Maylin, please," he whispered. "I can't." "You can," she said. "We are close. The clay is changing color. Look at your feet." Samuel looked down. In his rage, he hadn't noticed. The gray clay at the bottom was streaked with veins of darker, reddish earth, damp earth. He touched it. It was cool. A jolt of electricity went through him. He stood up, grabbing the hammer. He looked up at her, and she nodded, a single, sharp movement. He placed the chisel against the rock floor and swung the hammer. Clang! The sound was different now, deeper. He swung again, and again. He lost track of time. He was no longer a man. He was a machine driving steel into the heart of the world. And then it happened. The chisel punched through into emptiness. A hiss of air escaped, smelling of wet minerals and deep, cold places. He pulled the chisel back, and a sound followed it, a gurgle, a rush. Water, clear and cold, began to bubble up around his boots. It wasn't a trickle, it was a surge. "Maylin!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Send the bucket! Send it down!" The news of the water strike at the ranch spread slower than the gossip about the bride, but it hit with more impact. In a valley where men were shooting their cattle to save them from thirst, water was more valuable than gold. But it wasn't just water. It was the fact that they had found it on the high ridge, a place everyone knew was dry. Samuel and Maylin didn't hoard it. They couldn't. The flow was steady, filling the trough and spilling over into a makeshift irrigation ditch Maylin had already mapped out. The garden, which had been clinging to life, exploded into green. The corn stalks straightened, the squash vines raced across the ground, and the beans flowered in bursts of white and purple. The ranch became an oasis, a smudge of emerald in a landscape of brown. One afternoon, a wagon rattled up the drive. It was Thomas again, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a dusty humility. His face was gaunt, and his horses looked ragged. He climbed down slowly, holding his hat in both hands. Samuel was on the porch, whittling a new handle for the pickaxe. Maylin sat beside him, mending a shirt. They didn't stand up. Thomas stopped at the foot of the steps, licking his cracked lips. "Sam," he said, his voice raspy, "my well's dry. The creek's dust. I got 3 milk cows left. And the bull." He paused, looking at the ground. "I can't let 'em die, Sam." Samuel looked at his neighbor. the man who had mocked his wife, who had bet on his failure. He felt the cold satisfaction of power, the ability to say no and watch Thomas break. He looked at the water trough, brimming and clear, reflecting the sky. Then he looked at Maylin. She wasn't looking at Thomas. She was looking at Samuel. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were expectant. She was waiting to see what kind of man he was, now that he had won. Samuel set the knife down. He remembered her words. You do not break a mother. You ask her for help. He realized then that the water wasn't his. It belonged to the land. He was just the steward. Bring them over, Samuel said quietly. The lower pasture has runoff. They can graze there. There's water enough. Thomas looked up, shock registering on his face. He blinked rapidly, fighting back emotion. I can pay you, Sam. I have some silver. Samuel shook his head. No silver. Just bring them. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked at Maylin. He didn't know how to address her, so he simply bowed his head, low and respectful. Ma'am, he said. Maylin nodded back, a small, gracious incline of her head. Bring the calves, too, she said softly. The grass is sweet. Thomas climbed into his wagon and drove off, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Samuel turned to Maylin. You were right, he said, about the water, about everything. Maylin smiled, a rare, true smile that transformed her face. Not everything, she said. I thought you were a stubborn fool, but you learn fast. Autumn came to the valley not with a bang, but with a golden, heavy peace. The heat broke, replaced by crisp mornings that frosted the fence posts, and evenings that smelled of wood smoke and curing hay. The harvest from Maylin's garden was bountiful, filling the cellar with jars of preserved beans, dried corn, and squash that glowed like orange moons in the dark. The cattle were sleek and heavy, their coats thickening for the winter. The ranch had not just survived, it had thrived. The town's attitude had shifted completely. Maylin was no longer the Chinese girl or the curiosity. She was Mrs. Coulter, the woman who found water, the woman who had saved the herd. When they went to church, people made room in the pews. Women asked her about herbs. Men asked Samuel about the well. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet evenings on the porch. The sun was setting earlier now, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Samuel and Maylin sat in the rocking chairs, a blanket spread over their laps to ward off the chill. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, rich with shared history and the comfort of presence. Samuel looked at her profile, illuminated by the dying light. She was wearing a new dress, one she had sewn herself from blue calico, but she had embroidered red flowers along the collar, a piece of herself woven into the fabric of the West. He thought about the day she arrived, the shock of that red dress against the dust. He thought about the fear he had felt, the certainty that he was too broken to be mended. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused like his, the skin stained faintly with the earth they had moved together. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over and interlaced her fingers with his, a grip that was solid and warm. The winter will be cold, Samuel said, his voice soft. We have wood, Maylin replied, looking at the stack of logs by the barn. We have food. We have water. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight. We have a home. Samuel squeezed her hand. Yes, he said, the words settling deep in his chest, filling the hollow places that had been empty for so long. We have a home. They sat there as the night came on, watching the moon rise over the ridge where the water still flowed. Two people who had been strangers, who had been lonely, now anchored to the earth and to each other, ready for whatever the winter would bring.